the A Way to Live Well podcast. My name is Anna Maria and I'm your host. I've been running this podcast for well over a year now, and every guest I have brings with them a whole lifetime of experience, knowledge and insight into areas that are so important and so relevant and that we don't always have access to. That's why I really, really value these conversations. This week's show is no different. My guest on this week's show is Ellie Frith. Ellie is a school teacher and a podcast host. Her podcast focuses around mental health, particularly her own story of living through mental illness, going through a psych ward, and sharing other people's stories who she met along that journey, helping others to hopefully navigate their own mental well-being through her powerful stories and words. Hey Ellie, how's it going? Thanks so much for coming and chatting to me on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I'm really keen to get into hearing all about what you do and how you came to be doing this. So maybe you could go into that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So essentially my story is that I'm a teacher, I'm an English teacher, and I work in a secondary school, and last summer I had a nervous breakdown because I didn't feel that the results that my children achieved were good enough, and I took sole responsibility and accountability for those results, and things spiraled very quickly downward, and essentially I ended up attempting to take my own life, and I ended up in a psychiatric hospital, and I was there for about 3 months, and then I was discharged at the beginning of January this year. And then just, trying to take some steps into recovery on the outside world in the community. And then obviously very soon after that, the coronavirus hit, and the world was changed once more, which, to be honest, by this point I was like, yep, okay, fair enough. Seems fairly normal. And I decided to channel all the stories and all of the stuff that I'd learned from my experiences on a psych ward into my own podcast, in which I could give the people who perhaps are sometimes overlooked or misrepresented in society a voice. And so that's what I kind of aim to do now through my podcast. So yeah, that's my story.
So, the interesting thing about mental health is that we don't even consider it until it's gone, in a way, or that we have some kind of imbalance within it, right? And I wonder if you could speak to if there was anything that kind of gave you clues to the fact that you might be heading in that direction, or if you could go back, what steps would you have taken?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, in that at the time, before it happened, I didn't really think that there was anything wrong with me at all, and that I thought that I was completely normal. And even when I'd had the breakdown and I went to the doctors, my husband took me to the doctors, and he said, well, I think you're depressed. And I said, oh, I don't think so, because my impression of what depression was that it was just feeling a bit down, or something. I didn't think it was something that would happen to me, because for some reason in my head I thought, well, obviously that's something that happens to other people. But actually, if you look back over the last 2 years prior to the breakdown, there were loads of warning signs, mainly to do with the fact that I had no pattern for self-care whatsoever. I essentially worked myself to the bone. I would get into work about 6:20, and I would leave basically when the cleaners shut the school. So anywhere, again, 12, 13-hour days were pretty standard for me. And then obviously if you had parents' evening on top of that, they'd go on longer. And I would ensure that I worked one day of the weekend for definite. And sometimes that would then, the more, obviously the length of time that this went on for, it never felt like I was working hard enough. So then I would have to try and work even harder. And then if I did do something social, like go to a friend's or something, I found myself getting quite irritated and anxious, because I'd be thinking, I'm here, but this is a waste of my time, and I want to be working. I had racing thoughts. I became really reliant on caffeine as well, because obviously I was exhausted. So I'd be drinking loads and loads and loads of coffee, and then I wouldn't be able to sleep, and my heart would be racing. And I just had this huge fear that I wasn't good enough and people were going to find out that I wasn't good enough. And then for me, the results and then being what I perceived to be poor results, that was like a moment where I was revealed to be as incompetent as I felt. And so, yeah, I'd say any sort of, if your inner monologue is just completely negative as mine was, that isn't you. That's not natural. I don't think that's an identity. I think that is a sign of depression, I would say.
It's interesting, that inner monologue, right? We all have it, and we grow up in it, and it develops in with us, so that we feel that it is who we are in a way. So how and what moments can we recognize that before we spiral into this kind of potential for breakdown, right? How do we start to recognize that? Have you any tools?
Well, I think one of the things that you have to do is recognize, number one, that you are not your thoughts. Like, your thoughts do not define you as a human being. And actually, like I mentioned, your thoughts are formulated from a very young age in terms of the patterns that you have and the way in which your brain focuses and fixates on specific things. And that's just because, it's like a live feed that constantly needs stimulation. And if you don't give it positive things to focus on, it will just automatically, especially if you're slightly kind of programmed to think in a negative way, it will just generate negative thoughts. So a lot of the things that I would do would be I was convinced that I understood how other people thought and what they thought about me specifically, and I would just assume all of the time that if I did something at work, that what people would think about it, and it would be negative, and they would think that I could have done it better, and it had annoyed people. And I just started kind of challenging my own thoughts and just saying, well, how often do you notice certain things, like the things that you're noticing in yourself, like, oh, I trailed off then, or oh, I asked a really stupid question. Like, how often would you notice those behaviors in other people? It's very unlikely that you would. And so just kind of realizing that you're not the center of everyone's world is really helpful, I find, just in terms of remembering that actually no one cares as much as you care in your head. And actually, that part of you, one of the things I had to become really quite good at in order to be able to survive the depression that took me into hospital and several suicide attempts, was to realize that if I follow the train of thought that my brain is going along with, I will that thought pattern is trying to kill me, essentially. Like, it's actively seeking my demise and my downfall. And even if those thoughts are true, they are not going to, because you have to acknowledge as well, well, there could be some truth in what they're saying. Maybe I did trail off there, but I guess it's about challenging those thoughts and then recognizing, whether those thoughts are going to contribute to anything positive or serve you in any positive way. And if they're not, then what's the point in fixating on things which are, and I know it's so difficult, isn't it? Because that, as you say, it's programmed, but at the same time, I find the more that you challenge your thoughts, the better you become at doing so. And I also
Yes.
think if you can do positive things that are almost there as like an argument against your negative thoughts. So someone once said, I can't remember who it was, but they said, if you want self-esteem, you have to do esteemable things. So if I'm saying to myself, oh, you're useless, you're worthless, you do nothing, and I think, well, actually, no, I do. I volunteer on a Tuesday or whatever, which is what I used to do before the coronavirus. Just little things like that are arguments against your own inner voice of criticism.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Our judgments are such a downfall, right? And I think that's a good place to look, because you're judging that other people are judging you, and then if you think about the things that you judge others on, you're probably judging yourself on those even harder. So it's like this vicious cycle of
Yeah,
just
and it's almost like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, because if you think to yourself, oh, I'm not competent enough to be doing this job or whatever, like giving a presentation, I shouldn't really be doing this, then the way in which you deliver that presentation or you conduct the job or whatever, you're going to do that with the belief that you aren't good enough to be doing it, and that's probably going to affect your performance in doing it. So you're confirming your own criticism by telling yourself that. So it's like a poison that just feeds on itself. It is awful.
Yes, it's so true. There is a sort of, I guess it's a quote as well. So your beliefs sort of direct your thoughts direct your actions, and then your actions create results that feed back into your beliefs, right? They produce the results that you're expecting to get because that
Yeah.
chain of effects, right? It's so crazy. It's yeah, we're complex and very layered, and there's always stuff revealing itself to us all the time. I think
Yeah.
there's this there's this term in yoga. It comes from the sutras, and it's sauka. So it's this idea of um take learning to really fully integrate taking care of our body as our home, as our like most treasured possession in this life, you know. And I think a lot of us under or have a notion of the things that we should be doing that are good for us, but we don't do them, you know.
Mm.
And it's like, how do we kind of break through that barrier of being like, okay, I know I should be doing those things, but it's kind of like a metal bar, right? You keep bending it at the same point, right? Over and over again. And it's got a lot of give in it, you know? But
Yeah.
then that point when you just break it, right? Because you think you have all this stamina, or like you said, that's not going to happen to me because whatever, my mindset is stronger than that. But it's us just kind of pushing down these
Mm.
negative thoughts and emotions for so long. I wonder if you could speak to the kind of positive ways that you're taking care of your body now.
Yeah, just to add to that, for me it was almost addictive as well, like reaching my capacity, just within my capacity, and being able to at the end of the day go, oh my gosh, I had a meeting before school, I had one at lunchtime, I taught you know, and just at the end of the day, and then thinking, well, if I can do that, what more can I do? And it becomes like this really, it's a form of self-harm almost, you know, it's taking from you all the time. I think the things that you can do, first of all, in regards to relationships, because certainly the way in which I operated within relationships was just to have absolutely no boundaries, and anything that anyone wanted from me I would just give, because the more I gave, the more likely I was to be worthy or be enough for other people or whatever. And so I think it's about recognizing that I wouldn't expect anybody else to give me all of themselves to the point where that, you know, where was harming themselves. I wouldn't want my friends to, I don't know, come and see me if that meant that they had to sacrifice their sleep or something. So I think it's just about having boundaries within relationships. And that isn't, when I first heard of boundaries, I thought that that meant, you know, almost being rude to people, or, but that isn't what it is. I think it's more of a case of just saying, well, I can't do this right now, or this isn't appropriate at this moment, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to do this, or it doesn't mean I don't want to talk about this at all, I just don't want to talk about something right now. And it's, I guess it's a form of self-protection, and it's a form of self-care. And kind of the things I do on a daily basis involve having a good structure to my day, so ensuring that I get up in the morning, early in the morning. I don't like to lie in. I think that's, for me, potentially very negative for my mental health. I always make sure that I have things, as I said, which I can refer to, which are things I can say to myself, no, you baked today, or you did the garden today, or you helped a neighbor out, or whatever you did. But I plan in things which are esteemable, I suppose. I make sure that I exercise pretty much every day, even if it's just going for a walk somewhere in nature. I find that exercise has an amazing way of transforming your perspective on things. So you can wake up in a really negative mood and then go for a run, and your mood's shifted and your thoughts have shifted. And I think, again, that's an example of how you're not your thoughts, because they change so quickly. um, and I think also making sure you get enough sleep, eating well. It's the things that we all know are good for us, but we don't, sometimes we think, actually, no, I'll feel really good if I eat this massive pizza and then loads of ice cream. And you might feel good at the time, but then afterwards you don't necessarily look at that choice and think that was a great choice for my mental health, you know. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think, I guess, it's I wish I could say that I have all the answers and everything's working for me, and, you know, but that isn't the case. Like, I'm definitely in the process of trying to figure it out. But from what I'm gaining at the moment and what I'm learning at the moment is living moderately, I think, is the best thing to do, and spreading yourself moderately, not overextending yourself. Yeah, which is hard to do.
Yeah, really hard to do, especially if that's innate in your character, right? I don't know, you probably grew up and that was sort of the way you were in your family, you know, and then you take that forward into your friendships and stuff like that. Maybe you're the person who's always there for everyone, you know, and how do you extract yourself from that without losing who you have created yourself to be, right? Or, you know, it's really challenging. I've definitely struggled with overextending myself for people or doing things because I feel like it will be something that will be seen in a good light. You know, it's so easy to do the thing you want to, you know, it's like a people pleasing, say, you know, you want to do something to make other people happy, but at what expense, right? At probably your own expense. But I
Yeah.
think the boundaries thing is really, really important. And I think they also, boundaries change, right? Sometimes within a relationship, it's like you always need to navigate that. Maybe your boundaries are here today or there tomorrow, and depending on, like, have you ever heard this term of spoons, how many spoons you
Yeah, how many spoons you have in
right?
your drawer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's
Yeah.
this notion that, like, we only have a set amount of spoons per day or per in general, right? And how
Yeah.
many you're able to give out. So
I
yeah.
think it's really liberating as well to know that actually, although, I mean, I certainly had this sense because I came out of hospital and I had to kind of re-examine my life and think, right, okay, well, what was I doing that was making me unwell and bringing me to the point where I didn't want to live? And if I felt very strongly that if I didn't do that, it was very likely that I was going to end up in a very similar situation, which I'm very keen not to do. So so then when I was re-examining my life and thinking, where do I want to place my emphasis? What do I want to prioritize my time on? I then had this sense that I needed to justify or explain myself to other people or society or the world so that everyone was okay with the decisions that I was making for me. And it was really liberating to realize that actually you don't need anybody else's approval to make the decisions which you know are best for you. And I suppose that when it comes to boundaries as well, that's fine. If you want to make a career change and you don't want to have to justify that to your best friend, then don't justify it. Just say, this is the choice I've made and it's best for me. And that's such a liberating thing.
Yeah, that's beautiful, because I think it can get murky as well, right? If you start to put out your thoughts to people, like some people are like, will share their ideas with everyone to be like, to gauge what they should do. And it's like, why don't you just check back in with yourself first before you like get really like distracted by everybody else's opinion on it? And
Yeah.
and it sounds really simple, but it's hard. Sometimes we need help, or we want somebody to direct us. It's easier to do that, right, than to actually sit with ourselves and be like, all right, what do I really want and what will make me happy? And it sounds selfish, but it's really, really not, right?
No, and it is, you're right. It's so, because I would ask my husband questions which he could not possibly answer regarding like what I should do in the future, what was the right thing. And, you know, just because someone's close to you, that doesn't mean that they have a deeper understanding of of you necessarily in terms of the future. So yeah, it's challenging.
Really challenging. and and how are your kids doing now? How's everything with them? Are they
Um, you mean in school?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and in general, how did you guys navigate this time? Like, did you speak about it, or how do you even broach?
Well, so it's quite interesting actually. So because of the coronavirus and also because that environment wasn't great for me, I didn't return to that workplace. However, I, through my podcast, gained an insight into their perspective because the local newspaper interviewed me, and I naively assumed that no one reads the local newspaper, when in matter of fact a lot of people do apparently. And all of these students that I taught contacted me via the podcast's social media and said, like, they were so sorry to hear about what had happened to me and how I'd really, really helped them, and all of these really lovely comments. And it was it had a real feeling of like resolution to it in terms of me making peace with the fact that actually all of my worst fears, which were that these students would condemn me for the poor results that I felt that they had achieved, were completely false and not what was actually the reality, it turned out, of how they responded to the results, but also how they responded to me. Because I know for a fact that when you're 14, 15, 16 years old, you aren't necessarily fully mature in terms of understanding things as complex and difficult as mental health. And certainly often students don't necessarily see teachers as well-rounded human beings. They kind of just see them as robots who live in school and kind of, I don't know what happens to them in the holidays, they power down or something.
Yeah.
But they really surprised me with their emotional maturity and their ability to say, you know, we I don't know, I don't know how to express it, but they really, it was a lovely, lovely thing to think that actually they acknowledged me as a human being, and they acknowledged that because I was a human being, I needed time away from school. And yeah, I mean, I'm still, even now, getting. I had a student come up to me the other day when I was walking my dog, and they said, "Miss, thank you for teaching me." And I'm sure that there are. Do you know what the other thing is that's liberating is there are probably students who do think that maybe I wasn't a good teacher, or that I didn't get them the grade or whatever, but that's okay, because I feel like I'm now in a place where it's lovely to have feedback from students, but it's also okay if they have a different opinion of me, because I feel like throughout this breakdown, what I was looking for, and perhaps why I had the breakdown, was because I was looking for an identity that I founded completely in my job. And by kind of recentering where my identity is, I'm more secure in people having um, a disapproval or sense of disappointment in me, because I'm okay with me more than I was.
Mm.
um, so yeah, that was really long-winded. Sorry.
No, not. Do you think you were like setting unrealistic sort of goals for yourself, or
Oh
how was
yeah.
it?
Yeah, they were really unrealistic. Because I mean, I work in a deprived area, and but I was convinced, the idea that, if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything that you want. And I 100% worked as hard as I possibly could and more. Um, and I couldn't understand. I think that's why like, it was like my brain broke, because I was like, but I've put this into the machine. Why have I not got this result? Like, why? And there was no. Sometimes I think as well, you have to make your peace with the fact that there are things that you just will never know. You just won't know, and that's life, and you have to just learn to be okay with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We really do live in a culture where, better, faster, stronger, you'll get to, be superstar status if you put this amount of work in. But what if that isn't your dream or your goal, or that isn't what's within you, and we're all reaching for these heights that are unrealistic, maybe for ourselves, that aren't even actually our dreams or goals, right? Maybe we just want to be balanced and enjoy moments.
Yeah, I think like people are almost indoctrinated to believe that these things will make them happy. And I was doing pretty well in terms of the responsibilities that I had as a teacher, and I'd taken on way more than I could cope with, but obviously I didn't realize that at the time. But I had all of this additional responsibility, and so from the outside it looked like I was really successful, but I don't think I ever had a moment where I was proud of what I'd achieved, or where I felt successful, or where I felt competent. And so it was meaningless, because you know I don't think there would have been an end point to it. I think it would have just continued to become progressively, my expectations of myself would continue to be way above what was even possible. And therefore, I would always be a failure to myself. And I think actually in life, if you're able to be content with who you are and not who you're expected to be, or you perceive yourself to be expected to be by society, you're in such a better position to live a happy and well life, I would
Yeah,
say.
that's a really main point, right? This perception of what we think other people would see us living up to. It's like nobody thinks that. Nobody's like, oh wow, you really didn't reach the heights that I thought you were going to reach, like that
Yeah.
just doesn't happen. That's, again, it's another like negative thought that's going on in our head. I must appear a certain way in order to get the commendations or like accolades that I am supposed to live up to in other people's eyes. And that's, yeah, it's not real, again.
No. And anyone who is, if anyone is looking at you through that level of scrutiny and criticism, it actually speaks volumes about their own internal voice and their own criticism and scrutiny. And so I would now kind of feel sorry for them and think, gosh, they are probably in need of support, without maybe even knowing it. And I kind of consider myself to be almost fortunate. I mean, if you'd said this to me at the time, I would have said absolutely not. But now I consider myself fortunate to have gone through this breakdown and this turmoil and suicide attempts and all the rest. I'm fortunate because I've been brought to a point in my life where I've had to look at my life and I've had to make changes and I've had to re-examine my values and my self-worth and my identity. And as a result of that, I now have a strong sense of who I am, and I know um, that going forward, I'm in the best position to be happy in life, which surely is kind of why we're all here in a way. Because I think a lot of people live for happiness in the future that they may have in the future. Like when this happens, then I'll be happy, and there's no guarantee that that day will ever come. So yeah.
So true. Just these, yeah, moments of happiness. The everyday adventure, I think, is so important, right? Just seeing the beauty and like everything that you were talking about earlier, like just going into nature. It's like how wonderful to just step out into even your local park and be surrounded by trees and green and smell all the smells and hear all the things you can hear. And
Yeah.
that's life, right? That's it happening right in front of you.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are probably a million miles away when they're having those walks as well, but
Yeah.
it's just taking those moments. It's really, really important. And I'd love to hear about your podcast, how that came into being and what you kind of chat about on it.
Yeah. So my podcast is called the Chewy Head Podcast, and essentially it's called the Chewy Head Podcast because I used to teach this girl, and she always used to say to me, she was quite lazy, and so I would always be like, "No, come on, you need to do this. You need to add a bit more to your answer or whatever." And she'd be like, "Oh, Miss, you're chewing my head," and I was like, "Am I? I don't think I am." I was like, "What do you mean?" She was like, "Oh, you're chewing at my brain." And that really resonated with me because I could, there are, in life when things just get to you and they get underneath your skin, and in a way that is a little bit like what having a mental illness is like. But also the texture of something being chewy is that it's malleable, it changes, and again, hopefully that's the positives that we can take from mental illness is we can see positive growth in ourselves, I suppose. So essentially I'm in my first series, and each week I look at a different patient that I met on the ward. So I was on two wards. I moved from one to the other halfway through my stay because I think the first ward were like, "What do we do with you?" Because they didn't have very many therapies. They're all so loads of reasons, but they moved me. And one of the things which I really wanted to get across, and was fortunate enough to be able to get across because I was on the ward for such a long time. I got to see people come and I got to see people go, and a lot of the stories were really interesting, and some of them were quite funny. But most of them, not to be depressing, were quite sad in that it wasn't as if these people were being restored or made to grow. It was almost like they were being brought to a level of, I don't know, sanity, for want of a better word, or socially acceptable behavior. And once they were restored to that level, they were reintroduced back into society and into the community, rather than it being a place of recovery and becoming well. There were people who came into hospital believing they were God, and they left hospital believing that they were God, but they were just more quiet about those beliefs. And so what would happen, and what does happen tragically, is that people spend their whole lives going in and out of psychiatric wards, and that ruins their lives and it ruins their families' lives, and it's a really hopeless situation. And I just, I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. So, but on the positive side, I also met people. Well, every single person that I met, I feel taught me something and helped me. And so selfishly, I talk about what I learned, but also what we can all learn, and how actually a lot of the things that we think we understand about different mental health illnesses, we don't necessarily understand. And I don't think, for example, that there is one type of depression. I was given a diagnosis of atypical depression, which at the time I was like, so are you just saying I'm not depressed then? Is that what you're saying? But that wasn't the case at all. And I was psychologically very depressed. But in terms of, I would get up still and I would eat and I would walk around, and a lot of people just would lie in bed all day. And so I guess I'm just trying to start a conversation about mental health, contribute the little information that I might have and my own experiences, and also just open a space where people start talking about their own mental health and recognizing that it isn't an us and them scenario. That's not the case at all. It's the fact that we all have heads and we all have brains, and we will all have moments in our lives where perhaps we won't become schizophrenic, or I don't know, develop a personality disorder, but we might have moments where we feel depressed or anxious, or we might feel more paranoid than we normally do. And actually, that's just all part of a spectrum of mental health, because I think it's an extension of your physical health. And I think the more that people talk about it and understand that that mad person that you see on the street, or the person that you're calling a psycho, or they're human beings, and if they are if they are presenting that way on the street, then that's because the service that's supposed to support them isn't. And that's sad, and that's not okay. And I suppose I'm trying to speak into that.
Yeah, that's really amazing. It's really great to be able to take what you went through, which was really quite devastating, I'm sure, for you and your family and everything like that, and then sort of transmute that into something positive that you can share outwards to the rest of the world. I wonder, do you feel like you just had a really great support system that helped you through it? Because it sounds as though maybe this place that you were in wasn't exactly maybe the best fit for you or for anyone by the sounds of it. But
I did have a good support system, and I don't know, I think for me it was recognizing that no one was going to come in and fix me. No one was going, it wasn't that something was going to be done to me and that would be the miracle cure. I don't think that is how mental health works. I think that you have to take accountability for your mental health, and that doesn't mean that you blame yourself and say, oh, I'm depressed and that's my fault. That's not the point. It's more about acknowledging that actually although you might not be able to control the negative thoughts that occur in your mind, you are able to, I suppose, like we talked about, you can focus on other things, you can distract yourself, you can try and focus on the positive and do esteemable things. And I suppose, I mean, if you look at things like people with addictions, they go to Alcoholics Anonymous, and the whole kind of model of that is about taking accountability for your addiction and working through life together collaboratively, and identifying things which make you vulnerable and things which help you to be stronger. And I don't know, so I think actually if you're able to kind of acknowledge, or certainly for me, when I acknowledged that taking a pill or whatever, that wasn't necessarily alone going to be enough to change me. And also at this point I was sectioned in hospital, and the prospect of me ever being let out also, it seemed at the time, was bleak. So I thought, right, I'm going to have to take some responsibility of my life, because nobody's living my life for me. And that's the hardest thing to do. But also, if you are able to do that, which I believe we all are, we are all, you've got to be your own hero in life, because no one will be your hero for you. And it's the hardest thing, but the most worthwhile thing. So, yeah.
yeah, love that. Okay. My final question, and this is, I ask all my guests this, is what does it mean to you? And given everything you've gone through, this is, I'm really interested to hear what you'll say. Is what does it mean to you to live well?
What does it mean to me to live well? I think living well is probably something that you spend your life defining. So I think it's a daily practice. It changes. It doesn't look the same as it did when you were 17. And actually, it's about growing in your own identity. And if you're growing in your own identity and who you are, and that's what you use to respond to the chaos of life with, then you're living well.
That's awesome.
I don't know.
No, that's a really great answer. I really appreciate that. Where can people go to hear your podcast, or to follow you and hear more about you, or maybe even chat with you if they feel like they could benefit from some of your insight?
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, I'm available on all good podcast channels, so Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all of them. So it's just the Chewy Head Mental Health Podcast. And I'm also on pretty much all the social medias, I think. So again, it's just Chewy Head Podcast.
Amazing.
So yeah.
Real simple. Ellie, it has been an absolute pleasure. I'm so honored that you came and take the time to have a chat with me today. That was some really great information. I'm sure people will find it really, really helpful.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really interesting discussion.
I highly recommend you head on over to the Chewy Head podcast to hear Ellie speak more about this issue. And also you can follow her on Instagram, Chewy Head Podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning in once again to this week's episode. I really, really appreciate you being here. If you find this interesting, helpful in any kind of way, I would also really be grateful if you could share with your friends, your family, or anyone you think might find this information helpful. As always, be well.